Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And it's often a bit of a cliche to say that our guest needs no introduction, but in this particular case, it's absolutely true. It's a really great privilege to be joined by the last governor of Hong Kong, and a patron of Hong Kong Watch, Lord Patten of Barnes, Chris Patten. Chris Patten, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to talk to you, Ben, and to do anything possible for Hong Kong Watch, which is an admirable organization, which continues to stir the world's conscience about what's been happening in Hong Kong.
Well, thank you very much, and we really appreciate all the support that you give us and continue to give the people of Hong Kong. Let me start by asking, as we approach the 24th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, and of course, very sadly, the first anniversary of the introduction of the draconian national security law, what are your reflections on the past 24 years since you left Hong Kong, and your insights on the situation today?
I noticed recently that a new Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister was sent to police the Chinese Communist Party's interests in Hong Kong. And he delivered a great deal of sort of wolf warrior guff about how what was happening in Hong Kong, what happened in Hong Kong was a terrible attack on the rule of law, that it was a terrible example of, as it were, black hands. He didn't, I think, use that expression, but external interference in Hong Kong, all that sort of drivel. And I compared him with the first foreign ministry official who was sent to Hong Kong after 1997, who was a man called Ambassador Ma Yuen, who had been the ambassador in London. He'd been somebody I knew quite well, and he's somebody who I spoke to before I went to Hong Kong as governor, and indeed invited to Hong Kong very soon after I'd arrived in governor, and set out for him, not for his agreement or approval, but I told him in broad terms what I was proposing to do in Hong Kong. And he might not have agreed with me, but I say now old-fashioned, he was a proper diplomat. He wasn't a propagandist, he wasn't a bullying lout. And the comparison between Ambassador Ma and the new guy is all too horrible. And it's an indication, I think, of what's happened in Hong Kong. I think after 1997, for several years, while things didn't go perfectly in Hong Kong, by and large, they went pretty well. And you could say of what China was doing could do better, but you could also have said that could do a lot worse. And I'm afraid doing a lot worse is what's happened. And I think it's because of two things, really. First of all, because I think that China is aware of the fact that it's in its peak power position in relation to the West, and that position is only going to decline over the next few years. So it's throwing its weight around while it can. And secondly, because under Xi Jinping, who's the lifetime boss of the Chinese Communist Party, I think there's been a growing understanding of the difficulty that the Chinese Communist Party has been having and will continue to have in keeping a grip on every aspect of life in China. And I think Hong Kong represents the sort of values which, for all its braggadocio, the Chinese Communist Party fears as an existential threat. What Xi Jinping attacked in an early instruction to his officials, the values of open liberal societies, not just Western, their values cherished in Taiwan, in Singapore, in India and elsewhere in Asia. But I think that Xi Jinping, far from being all powerful, is actually only too aware of the extent to which globalization, urbanization, changes in the internet have weakened the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to keep its grip on power. And I think that's led to both the increasing ferocity of the assault on Uyghurs in Xinjiang and to the attempt to stamp out the freedoms and liberties and undermine the rule of law in Hong Kong. And it's a terrible thing to see a great free city assaulted in this way by China. Now, just the other day, I noticed that President Xi Jinping made a speech, I think, to the Politburo, saying that China had to concentrate in its dealings with the majority of public opinion in showing that it was lovable, credible, and respected. Now, the Chinese communists, as you know, have a way of listing things, enumerating things, the 5 this, the 4 that. And I think these are the 3 incredibles. Is China, the Chinese Communist Party, regarded at the moment as lovable? Well, not if you're in large parts of China, including its colonial parts, Tibet, Xinjiang, not if you're in Hong Kong, the majority of whose population, of course, fled from Chinese communism to get to what was then a British colony. Is what the Chinese say credible? Is their refusal to give an open reckoning about how the coronavirus began, is that credible? Increasingly not. I'm not saying that we know exactly what happened, but if the Chinese keep on preventing anybody having a proper look at what's happening, it inevitably raises questions about China's credibility. And respected? Well, not respected because China keeps to the rules, not respected because it keeps to the international rule book, except when it suits it. So China has, for example, been throwing its weight around in the South China Sea, despite the clear verdict of the Hague Tribunal on Maritime Borders, and despite the commitments that President Xi Jinping made to Barack Obama when he went to see him in the United States. So credible, lovable, respected? I think not.
Well, there's a huge amount in there, and we'll come back to some of the points you've made in the course of the discussion. Let me just take a step back and go back 24 years or more and look at your 5 years as the last governor of Hong Kong. You mentioned Ambassador Ma. Could you share a bit about what were your biggest challenges and maybe misapprehensions in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party regime?
I think the biggest problem, the biggest challenge, was they had signed up in the joint declaration to a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong. They'd signed up for putting Hong Kong on a continuing conveyor belt to greater democracy. They were promising that they would do more than the limited amount that Britain had done. They signed up to the separation of powers in Hong Kong between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. They signed up to all those things, and I don't think that they ever really understood what they were. I don't think they really understood what they'd committed to do, and I think that's been the real problem as far as Hong Kong is concerned. And I think that in the early years, they were prepared to, let me make sure I'm plugged in properly. They were prepared to accept, they were prepared to accept that these things were in the joint declaration. More recently, I'm sorry, I'm about to run out of gas, which is why I'm doing this. More recently, they've pretended that what they signed up to was a historic document, not something that was lodged at the UN for committing them for 50 years. I hope you still got me. Yeah, sorry about that. I was noticed that my laptop was about to, my iPad was about to run out of power. So I think it was irrelevant. Get face out what they'd signed, a document lodged as an international treaty at the United Nations. Now, the Chinese have occasionally said over the years, as I mentioned just now, that this was just a historic document. Now, if we'd said about the lease, which produced the new territories, if we'd said that about the grant, part of one of the unequal treaties that gave us Hong Kong and the tip of Kowloon, gave us sovereignty back in the 1840s, if we'd said they were just historic documents, the Chinese would have taken it as an insult, and the world would have regarded with derision. So I think the world is entitled to regard the Chinese saying that an international treaty which they signed, which was supposed to commit them for 50 years, is simply a historic document of no account whatsoever. I think we're entitled to think that that's disgraceful behavior. Now, I want to make a distinction, Ben, straight away. Now that I'm plugged in again, I want to make a distinction between China and the Chinese Communist Party. Because one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party regularly does is to say that in order to love China, you have to love the Communist Party. And I guess for foreigners, what they're saying is you have to respect the Chinese Communist Party in order to show that you respect China. Now that's nonsense. We're not talking about some Leninist theological consubstantiality. Don't forget that most of the people who live in Hong Kong were refugees from the Chinese Communist Party. So they're not going to love the Communist Party. And trying to force that proposition down their throats wasn't, I think, going to lead to anything other than its regurgitation all over the carpet. Now what they're trying to do in Hong Kong, of course, is to engineer the children, engineer the curriculum, engineer what happens in universities in order to force people to accept that they mustn't ask questions, for example, about Tiananmen. It's very interesting that they've actually stopped people taking part in any sort of commemoration or vigil for those who were murdered in Tiananmen Square by the PLA, by the Communist Party. They've intervened to stop that with some half-baked excuse about coronavirus. It hasn't stopped them. It hasn't stopped people going to concerts or doing other things in large numbers. So if you wear a black shirt on the 4th of June, if you light a candle on the 4th of June, let alone if you try to march quietly or stand in Victoria Park, you're in some respect, some way disrespecting China. You're not disrespecting China at all. You're disrespecting the Chinese Communist Party's biased view of the history of China.
Absolutely. Before we continue with this pretty depressing picture, let me ask a positive question. What are some of your favourite memories of your time as governor?
Well, first of all, can I just say, I feel quite depressed, but ultimately I recognize that despite the efforts of these bruisers from Beijing, despite their efforts to put Hong Kong in handcuffs, the spirits of people in Hong Kong remain, in the majority of cases, resolutely turned to the light and turned to the candle towards the candles of freedom which still burn. My favorite experiences in Hong Kong were that, in a strange way, it underlined some of the political views which I'd taken for granted over the years. The relationship between economic freedom and political freedom, which was one reason why Hong Kong had been so successful. The importance of trying to ensure that there was greater social equity in Hong Kong, which I had wished we'd been able to do even more about. My favorite moments were very often the most personal. Going out with my family to eat in neighborhood restaurants, going for walks in the new territories or on Lantau or Lama. I had the privilege of that boat, the Lady Maureen, which we used a lot to cruise around the islands. I loved shopping in Hong Kong. I'm deeply into retail therapy, particularly when it involves buying fish or vegetables, or, as people know, I'm partial to egg tarts. So there are so many things, and I've written about it in the past. People have very often asked me to write about Hong Kong without talking about the politics. And I've written pieces for newspapers about why they should visit Hong Kong. I think it's more difficult to say that just at the moment because of the depressing nature of the bruises and the way in which some Hong Kong people, citizens, like Mr. C.Y. Leung, are encouraging people to become narcs, to inform on one another. It's disgraceful. It's awful. There's something else I feel about Hong Kong, which is very personal to me. And it sounds to some people a rather strange thing to say. I was happier being a Christian, being a Catholic in Hong Kong than I've ever been before or since, because I saw the church involved in so many different social activities, as well as, of course, being so involved, like Cardinal Zen, in the push to give people in Hong Kong the right to do more, to have more say in determining their own destiny. So it was a wonderful experience. I've been spent lockdown editing my Hong Kong diaries, which will, I think, be published next year by Penguin. And it's just reminded me again and again and again of what a privilege it was to be asked by the Prime Minister, by the British government, to spend 5 years as the last British governor in Hong Kong. I was there because of the vagaries of the British electoral system, but I was extremely lucky to be there, and it taught me a great deal, which I then took on to my job in the European Commission as responsible for Europe's relations with the rest of the world, including relations with China. And I think that when I was able to deal with China in that period, I was told by the Chinese authorities that I was a force for concord, not discord, and I was invited on a private visit to China with my wife by President Jiang Zemin. So, you know, the name calling, the shouting, the rubbishing, the sort of vulgarity of Communist Party politics goes up and down, and very often you find a really decent Chinese politician or official, intelligent and well-meaning, and you make the most of it. I was very lucky to have so many terrific Chinese patriots among the Hong Kong civil service. The fact that they were Chinese patriots didn't mean they were followers of the Communist Party.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, having myself lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover, we didn't quite overlap. We just missed each other. I can really relate to so many of the things you've said there: the islands, the shopping, and the Catholic Church. And I actually, under lockdown, have gone insofar as one can, online to Mass in the cathedral in Hong Kong, and have been very inspired by that. And your diaries, I'm sure, will be eagerly awaited, and really look forward to reading those. Let me ask you, before we return to serious matters, you said quite rightly that you're well known for your love of egg tarts. Have you been able to get any since you left Hong Kong?
Oh yes, I've been regularly presented with them by people coming from Hong Kong to London, and in one or two cases actually leaving them on the doorstep of my home. Indeed, on one occasion, I was not only left some egg tarts, but also left one of the geese from the Yung Ki restaurant on Victoria Island, which is where I used to go very regularly, where I once took Chancellor Kohl, the German head of government. So, wow. Yeah, but there's nothing remotely as good made in Britain in the egg tarts department as the ones we made in Lyndhurst Terrace.
Absolutely. Just looking at Britain's record of response to the situation in Hong Kong since the handover. So, some years ago, you criticised the British government for, if I have the words correctly, its what you called anodyne 6-monthly reports, and for being, quote, restrained in its response to the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms in previous years. In the last year, the British government has perhaps taken, certainly rhetorically, a stronger position, and of course has offered this very generous offer to British national overseas passport holders. Do you think the UK now has done enough, has made up for its past weaknesses, or is it too little too late? And if so, what more should it do?
Well, it's done more, and I don't criticize at all what it's been doing. I certainly think that it went through that deluded period of the alleged golden age of relations with China. While we were celebrating this golden age, it wasn't doing actually much for our trade or investment. What it was doing, what was happening at the same time, was the Chinese Communist Party was starting to put the squeeze on Hong Kong. So it wasn't exactly a golden age, if you take that into account. We've never had any element in our relationship with China which is as big as our relationship as a responsible authority in Hong Kong. I mean, that's always been much the biggest of the elements in our relationship, not as some people in the Foreign Office in the past used to seem to believe that Hong Kong was a sort of pebble in the sandal. Hong Kong was hugely important as part of our relationship. Don't forget that when we left in 1997, Hong Kong was represented over 18% of Chinese GDP. The fact that it's much lower today is a celebration of the fact that with open markets in the West, China's been developing more, though I think that will be rather more constrained in the future by a number of things, including demography and the environment. But no, I think that the British government, since the crackdown, has behaved much more honourably. I welcome what's been done about B&O passports. I think it's very important that the British government should continue to work with others to ensure that the world doesn't forget about Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang, for that matter, or let alone Taiwan, where the Chinese have been behaving outrageously towards an island which has never actually been run by the PRC, by the People's Republic of China, and which has only a vestigial relationship with the Qing dynasty. Indeed, one Qing emperor, Kangxi, said that it wasn't part of his dominions when he tried to sell it, I think, to the Dutch in the 17th century. So yeah, I mean, I think that the British government has done pretty well, but it's going to have to continue to. It's very important that we work with our allies, not, as the late Gerald Siegel used to say, to contain China, but to constrain China. And when China behaves badly, we have to work with our allies, with our friends, Australia, Canada, the United States, South Korea, Japan, Europe, in most cases, and actually make clear to the Chinese that they can't pick us off one at a time by sort of coercive bullying. What they've been doing with a country like Australia recently is in breach of the agreements they made with the WTO. They've behaved outrageously, and we should call them out together.
Mm-hmm. The Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has said that China is now, I think in his words were, a permanent or repeated breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. If the democratic world led by the UK doesn't call them out for that and find ways to address those breaches, what are the implications, in your view, for the international rules-based order to have a regime repeatedly flouting an international treaty?
Well, the implications are very considerable. And of course, it's not the first time this has happened. To have the Chinese refusing to accept the findings of the International Tribunal in The Hague on maritime boundaries in the South China Sea is another example of how badly they've behaved. We know that whatever the precise origins of the coronavirus, they were in breach of the international health regulations, which they'd signed up to in, I think, 2005 or 6, after the SARS outbreak, because they didn't give the sort of timely warning of what was happening, which they undertook to do in the international health regulations. So you can look at one issue after another where they simply flout the international rules, and then the world, if we want those rules to apply to everybody, then we have to stand up and insist that they should apply to China as well.
Mm. Would you agree that over the last year, perhaps due to a combination of four main factors, the COVID-19 pandemic and the CCP's mendacity over that, the situation that you've already mentioned in Xinjiang, the debate over Huawei, and of course the crackdown in Hong Kong, that those four elements appear to have led to quite a significant shift in attitudes towards China and towards the CCP in Parliament, to some extent in government and in other parts of the democratic world. Do you think that people are waking up to the dangers of the CCP? And again, is it too little too late?
No, I think people are waking up, which is why, as I said at the outset, President Xi Jinping has been calling on the party to make sure that the Chinese communist regime is seen as being lovable, credible, and respected. As I said, the three implausibles. No, I think it's when people say how brilliant the Chinese are, it takes a certain amount of brilliance to unite the right and left in one country after another in criticism of China. And it takes a certain genius, I suppose, to make the impact on public opinion that they have. When you look at those polls which ask whether people trust China or not, overwhelmingly, people don't trust China. And that's not because of Chinese people. It's not because of brave and honorable men like Dr. Wenliang, who died when he tried to blow the whistle in Wuhan. It's because of the apparatchiks with no respect for other human beings who simply do whatever they're told by President Xi Jinping.
Just one last question on British policy, and then we'll come to some concluding questions. In terms of the balance of decision-making on UK-China policy, what do you think is the balance between the Treasury, the Foreign Office, and Number 10? And is that balance where it should be?
I just don't know. For some time, plainly, policy on China was made by the Treasury, and it was a pretty good disaster. While we were being told that we had a golden age, President Xi Jinping was instructing everybody to attack all the values that we represent and that other liberal democracies represent. But there's always an element of delusional commercial greed in attitudes to China. The fact that the Chinese, by and large, despite their occasional forays into bruising commercial coercion, for example, if somebody sees the Dalai Lama, they then get put in the chiller for some time. But despite that, by and large, Chinese business does what everybody else does. It buys what it can get at the best price, and very often, when it gets what it wants, steals the intellectual property and tries to make it itself. But by and large, the Chinese buy, like others, what they need and what they want. Chinese investment, similarly, Chinese investment isn't run by the St. Vincent de Paul Society. A Chinese investment isn't a sort of charitable donation. It's certainly true that the Hong Kong companies were wonderful investors in the United Kingdom, and we cherish their investments. But if you look at what the state-owned enterprises have done, the mainland companies, they either invest because they think they can make a buck, or they invest in order to try to establish a stake in a powerful and important sector of the economy, which is, I suppose, one of the things that Huawei was doing, which I hope will drive Britain and others into working collectively to develop our own non-Chinese Communist Party controlled contribution to 5G. What we should do in relation to China in economic and trade matters, and of course we should want to trade and do business with them, but we should do it on terms of reciprocity. How is it that it's so much easier for the Chinese to invest here or to sell their products here than it is for us to do the same in China? That's just not fair. So it's not credible, lovable, or respected, to borrow the three. So I'm also, while I think we should have a straightforward and sensible economic relationship with China. I also think we have to work very hard with China on issues like climate change and antimicrobial resistance. But not working with China doesn't mean spending your time on your knees. Doesn't mean that you have to play the game as though China was doing you a great favor by doing things which are in its own interest, even more sometimes than in ours. Antimicrobial resistance is largely, not entirely, but largely a consequence of the incontinent use of antibiotics in China, in agriculture as well as in public health. Climate change is one of the reasons for the appalling drought in northern China. I think I'm right in saying that 28,000 rivers have disappeared in the last 20 years. So these are issues where it's important to work with China, but we have to be sure when we do so that China keeps its word. If the rest of us sign up, for example, to phasing out coal-powered fire stations, it's not going to help very much if the Chinese open a new coal-fired power station every week. But the latest statistics suggest that in the last year, China added more to coal-fired emissions than the rest of the world reduced them by. So, you know, we should cooperate with China on these global issues. We should do so while insisting that they keep to their word, that they do what they say they'll do.
Absolutely. Can I ask a penultimate question? You said some very kind things about Hong Kong Watch at the start of the conversation, and we're delighted that you're one of our patrons. Why do you think the work of an organisation like Hong Kong Watch is important at this time?
For three reasons. First of all, it's very important in keeping Britain, but also the world, in touch with the horrible story of Hong Kong being strangled by the Chinese Communist Party. And we must not let any aspect of that slip by. So Hong Kong Watch has a terrific job in doing research and providing the results of that research to a wider community. Secondly, I think Hong Kong Watch is incredibly important in helping to keep the British government and other international governments on message on Hong Kong. And thirdly, because of the growing Hong Kong diaspora in other countries, not least in the United Kingdom. I mean, I live in a part of London where there's a growing Hong Kong community about half a mile from where I live. I mean, not because of me, but just because there were other Hong Kongers there to begin with, and I suppose they're more attracted to live there. One of my grandsons has two Chinese boys in his class at school. So because there's a growing Hong Kong diaspora, it's particularly important that we should go on using their intelligence about what's going on and conveying what we think is going on to them. And I hope that they will appreciate that. Hong Kong Watch is a very, very important part of our international media architecture, and I think it deserves every support.
Well, thank you very much. And again, we deeply appreciate the support that you give us. One final question. What message would you have for the people of Hong Kong as we approach this 24th anniversary of the handover, first anniversary of the national security law, and at a time when pretty much almost all the prominent pro-democracy leaders are either on trial, in prison, or in exile?
It's the most difficult question. A couple of years ago, I was taking a walk with my dog and one of my best friends, who's a Irish bishop who works in Rome. And we were walking in somewhere called the Isabella part of the Richmond Park. Wonderful azaleas and flowers in April and May. And we suddenly bumped into a group of 4 young Hong Kong students. And one of them said, do you remember me, Chancellor, he said. And he was a doctoral student at Oxford. And he showed me on his phone a photograph of me after I'd talked to Hong Kong students. And he'd had his photograph taken with me holding a yellow umbrella. And it was interesting, I have to say in passing, how many of mainland students wanted their photographs taken, not just Hong Kong ones. So he's with his girlfriend and another couple. And his girlfriend says to me, Mr. Patten, do you think we should go back to Hong Kong? And I said I thought that what Hong Kong represented was an inspiration for the rest of the world. And I hoped that the ideas that she and her colleagues believed in would ultimately triumph. He burst into tears. That was 2-3 years ago. And I've had the same question many times before and since. And it's become an increasingly difficult question to answer. Because who am I to suggest to people that if they think they're putting themselves in danger, or if they think that values which they cherish are being undermined permanently, who am I to say that they should go on fighting for those values? My only point that I would continue to make is that I don't think those values are going to be steamrolled into the ground by the Chinese Communist Party. By this, it's not Marxism, it's Leninism. It's Leninism, because actually in China itself, there's less social equity than there is in the United States. The top 20% in comparison with the bottom 20% have a multiple of 10 point something. It's about 8 in the United States. So Leninism, it's brutal totalitarianism. And I don't think that that is going to be the, well, heaven help us if it were to be the case. I don't think that's going to be the inspiration of the 21st century. So I would say to my friends in Hong Kong, Chinese patriots, but with a real sense of Hong Kong citizenship, I would say to them that I believe that what they stand for, what they represent, what they believe in, I believe that myself will survive and be an inspiration to others. But I can't, in all conscience, give people advice which I might have difficulty persuading my own children to follow. So it's difficult, but I welcome those who come to the United Kingdom and think that we're very, very lucky to have them, and that Hong Kong is unfortunate to lose them. On the whole, when Hong Kong citizens emigrate to Britain, it increases our IQ and energy, and I guess rather reduces that in Hong Kong. If Hong Kong is left in the hands of people like Tam Yusheng and CY Leung, heaven help us.
Mm. Well, on that note, which is a mixture of realism and encouragement and some inspiration, and this has been a fascinating conversation. I know that this conversation as a whole will be a source of encouragement to people in Hong Kong and from Hong Kong, wherever they are. So, Chris Patten, Lord Patten, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ben, for the conversation, and well done, Hong Kong Watch.
Thank you very much.